Okay, so let's kick off. So I'm not going to spend too long introducing everyone, but yeah, we've got lots of interesting papers on the topic of skills. So the first presentation is going to be from Elisa Staffa from the ESRI, looking at the empirical investigation of skills gaps in Europe.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much. I'm Elisa. This paper today is co-authored with Seamus McGuinness, my colleague from the ESRI, but basically is part of a Horizon Europe project 2023, that is Skills Pulse. With this project, we basically want to investigate skills predicting, understanding, and locating shortages in Europe. It's going to be until June 2027, and we basically already published some outputs, and we are looking into skill shortages and gaps in Europe, trying to understand how to measure them, how to understand how they impact society, labor market, and the society in general. We have different partners in different European countries. Specifically, in these papers, we focus on the concept of skill gap. So a skill gap is a situation where basically workers lack the necessary skills to do their job in an effective way. We estimated that in the last 20 years, there were only 7 academic papers published on skill gaps, so the literature is quite thin. But what's most important is that among the measurement approach, there is not actual a consistent approach for measure this kind of issue in the labor market. We can have employer-reported measures. Basically, they are survey data on employers where they directly ask employers on the level of the adequacy of the skills of their workforce. Then we have employee service, where employees are directly asked about their skills, if they think that they are enough to do their job. Or we also have, very rarely, we have also linked data, employee and employer, where both are asked about the level of the skills. I reported some papers on the employer-based measures, but today I'm going to focus on employee-based measures because this is what we employ in our paper. So I don't know if you are familiar with CDFOP, but it's a European agency that looks at vocational education, and they have this survey data set that is the European Skills and Job Survey, but wave 1 in 2014 and wave 2 in 2021. In the 2014 data sets, employees were asked, how would you best describe your skills in relation to what is required to do your job? And if a worker replied that the level of skills is lower, what is actually required to do their job, this is identified as having a skill gap, so being underskilled, a general skill gap. Then in the survey, there are also specific questions on specific competency areas. But what's most important also in other employee survey data set is that sometimes, of course, in the different surveys have different type of questions. So the question that has changed, but also they can change also within the same survey in different ways. And this is what happened to the European Skills Job Survey. So we are building on a previous job chapter that we published last year with Fondazione Giacomo Brodolini. And using the first wave of the European Skills Job Survey, we wanted to understand the extent of skill gaps in Europe in 2014. We found that 6% of workers reporting to be underskilled, so reporting the fact that their skills were not enough, or lower what was required to do their job in an effective way. We find relatively low share of people reporting basic skills in numeracy and literacy areas, but we also didn't find any wage effect associated with skill gaps, general skill gaps. But we find the negative, so a pay penalty associated with basic literacy gaps. So in this paper, we want to update the analysis using also the second wave of the data, that is 2021. As I will show you, there has been a change in the questions, and this causes inconsistencies, of course, in the measurement approach. I will talk try to show you the incidence of skill gaps in Europe, both general skill gaps and skill gaps in specific areas, and in particular then also under education, that is So we can say that this is an objective measure of skill gap, and then I will also show you some modeling. So first of all, under-education can be considered an objective measurement for skill gap because it depicts a situation where there is deficit in human capital accumulation. And under-education is a situation where the level of education of a worker is completed by the worker is lower what is required to do their job. And so we took data from both the waves of the European Skills and Job Survey, and we compare the highest level of education completed by the employee with the level required by the job according to the ESRI classification. We find in 2014 that over 14% of workers were undereducated. You can see the EU average, but of course we see much difference across country, with Italy, Portugal, Netherlands having the highest share of undereducation, while Hungary, UK, and Luxembourg having the lowest shares of undereducation. Then in 2021, we see that the share of undereducation dropped a bit, so from 14 to 12%, again with cross-country differences. What's most important is that the measurement approach for this is consistent. So we plotted the shares from the first wave against the shares from the first wave, and we found a high correlation. So this means that those countries where we found high under-education rates in wave one are also those countries where under-education rates are high in wave two. So we are measuring the same thing, we can say. Then when it comes to underskilling, as I showed you the question from the survey, this is the 2014 survey. The question was, how would you best describe your skills in relation to what is required to do your job? And if an employee replied, my skills are lower, what is actually required is underskilled. And the EU average in 2014 was 6.2, of course, with cross-country differences, like Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia having the highest shares of underskilling. But then in 2021, they changed the question. So now the question is, to what extent do you need to further develop your overall level of knowledge and skills to do your main job even better? And people could reply, great, moderate, small, and extent, or not at all. So you can see the end of the sentence, they are asked to do your main job even better. So it's not a matter of doing my job effectively, do I have the skills to do it, but to be like, to excel in what I'm doing and in order to be able to improve. Indeed, when we looked at general underskilling at great extent, we found that 17.2% of workers reporting to be underskilled or having a general skill gap. Again, we found cross-country differences. In this case, Romania, Luxembourg, Slovenia having the highest shares of general underskilling. But as we can see here, there is no correlation in the measurement from the first wave and the second wave. So we are not, unfortunately, let's say, measuring the same thing. We feel, and this came from our analysis that we show you, that in the second wave, with the question, we are capturing the essential skill gaps, so basically where workers really have a deficiency, but also those not essential skill gaps. Then we have questions related to specific skill gaps in specific competency area. So employees are asked, do you feel the need to further develop any of the following skills to do your main job even better? Again, this even better that comes back. So then I can reply yes or no. 30% of workers reply to have the need to develop their numeracy skills, 50% their social skills, and then 40% their technical skills. So very high shares of specific skill gaps. We also found that having a skill gap in a specific area is highly correlated with another area. So if in countries where numeracy skill gaps are high, are also those countries where social skill gaps are high, and so on, numeracy and technical, and then social and technical. So then we said, okay, where are the people that have these skill gaps? Like, what's the level of education that they obtained? We found that half of the people reporting these skill gaps, both general and specific, actually have a higher level of education. So they probably are also working, let's say, more highly qualified jobs, and this will come after. So we estimated first a general probit model for estimating the general characteristic associated with the general skill gaps and general underskilling. And we wanted to understand specifically how having a skill gap in specific areas impacts general underskilling. And then also we estimated basic OLS wage regression model because we wanted to understand if skill gaps, general skill gaps or specific skill gaps are somehow associated with wage penalty or not. We don't know. Like we know, we did the analysis from the first wave. We know something, but we want to see what's there in the second wave. So first of all, in our probit regression model, so we find that males, older workers, overeducated workers, and also people with previous experience of unemployment have a lower probability of reporting a general skill gap. Undereducated workers with a tertiary level of education and people on temporary contracts have a higher probability of reporting having a skill gap. And we also find that the three measures of skill gaps in the specific competency area are positively correlated with underskilling. You can see from the last column that if both numeracy, social, and skill gap have a positive and statistically significant coefficient. So having a skill gap in numeracy, for instance, increase the probability of reporting to have a general skill gap. So we said, okay, we also showed you we saw that most of the people reporting this kind of skill gaps also have a higher level of education. So what is going on there? Maybe our consideration were related to the fact, okay, maybe people that are in these jobs are actually working, let's say, are highly qualified. Maybe they are also working in jobs where where they are required to update their skills more often because the job is basically more complex, okay? So the European Skills and Job Survey has a lot of amazing questions on the level of task and competence that are required in the job and are used by the workers. So we build this job complexity measure that is built on reading, writing, and math tasks, so the task content of the job. The higher is this index and the more complex is the job, okay? When we plug in this job complexity measure in our model, we find it to be positively and statistically significant. So it's positively correlated with underskilling. So the more complex is the job, the higher the probability of worker to report a skill gap. Okay, and this is the model. Then we looked at wages. We found that, as you can see from the left column, this is basic means not so big, but means equation. So we control for gender, age, education, part-time, temporary, and previous unemployment. And we actually see that those people that report having a skill gap also have higher wages. And also, if you looked at technical skill gap, the coefficient is positive and statistically significant at a very low extent numeracy skill gap. So if I report that I have a gap in technical areas, I'm earning a higher wage. So this is counterintuitive, no? At the beginning, because if this is a gap, a deficiency, what is not what is going on? So again, we plugged in our job complexity measure, foundational skills index. What can we see there is that the coefficient is statistically significant and positive. So it means that the higher the complexity of the job, the higher the wage of the worker. At the same time, as you can see, our underskilling and our measure for specific skill gaps are not significant anymore. So this means that when skill gap exists, they are basically driven by workers that are motivated to keep pace with evolving requirements by their jobs. This type of skill gap, as I told you before, is probably capturing essential but also not essential skill gaps. So the fact that people just need to keep pace with the job requirements and want to update their skills more frequently. And this is, of course, it's a different view of having a skill deficiency, no? That is the traditional perception of skill gaps. Okay, so to conclude, I investigated the extent of general skill gaps and specific skill gaps in Europe. We saw that under the education has been declining over time. We saw that with the 2021 European Skills and Job Survey data, we found high rates of general and specific skill gaps. But we, as I told you, where skill gaps exist, they are likely to be driven by workers that want to keep pace with evolving requirements, the fact that they are in more complex jobs in general. We find that at the beginning, in under skilling and general skill gaps appears to be associated with the wage premium. But when we include job complexity, this premium disappeared. So if we take wages as a proxy for workers' productivity, we don't find evidence that skill gaps are actually associated with a negative productivity impact. I think that all this research points toward the fact that we need a consistent measurement approach for this type of issues, because maybe having a true skill gap is associated with a negative impact and negative productivity effect. But if we are not able to correctly measure something, we cannot try to understand how this affects the economy and the people and the worker. So thank you so much for the attention. And this is the link to the project without other publications and outputs. Thank you.
Okay, so does anyone have any questions? I'll bring you the mic if you do.
Here, I don't think I needed a mic, just closely. Oh, of course. No, my question is about maybe some non-linearities that might be in your model. I mean, are you assuming that because you use employees surveys, right?
Yes.
Is there a linear relationship between what your actual skill level is and what you perceive your skill to be? Because there is a non-linearity there, whereas those people who generally are actually more skilled are more likely to rate themselves as underskilled. You know, there's that sort of
a subjectivity, you mean?
Yes. Subjectivity. So I wonder is how you've included that in your analysis.
I mean, we use survey data, so there is the subjectivity of the worker in there. But this is
because that could be correlated as well with the variable about the complexity of work task as well. So
the perception, that's a good point. But this is the data that we have, so no, I will think about it more. But okay, thank you.
So I think we're gonna move on just because we're a bit tight for time. So thank you, Elisa.
Thank you.
So next we have Mark Magill from Ulster University presenting on the Northern Ireland Skills Barometer.
Hello, everybody. Yes, my name is Mark Magill. I'm from Ulster University Economic Policy Centre. So I'm going to talk through our work on the Northern Ireland Skills Barometer. So this is an older piece of research. My slides are playing tricks on me here. There's an older piece of research that we update every 2 years, trying to forecast the demand and supply of skills in the Northern Ireland economy. I'm just going to focus on the very high level macro story that comes out of it here. There's much, much more granular levels of detail in the reporting outputs, which are all available online. What we publish is a very detailed information pack there with lots and lots of information about the labour market and skills in Northern Ireland, sort of pushing up towards 300 odd slides. A summary report highlighting key information and a short piece of information targeted at schools that gets distributed to every school in Northern Ireland to highlight some careers type information about how investing in your own skills helps improve your labour market prospects. So I'll not go through a whole detailed spiel on methodology because it would take up my entire slot. But essentially what we have in Ulster University is an economic forecasting model which forecasts employment at 1-digit SIC level over the next 10 years. Our job here with the skills barometer is to build that out and build really detailed occupation forecasts because they tend to map a lot closer to skill requirements than industry data does. We build up a forecast also of the supply side of the economy. Long story short for that, it's doing a detailed analysis of school information, further education colleges, universities, linking it to demographic forecasts and assuming current enrollment and attainment patterns. So it gives you a profile of what the supply side is going to look like if nothing else changes other than the demographics. It's basically a policy do nothing scenario. And we bring those two sides together and then to try and identify if there are any skills gaps across the economy. And we look at that by qualification level and by subject type. So I'll just start on the demand side. So I should have said for the model, it's not really just a piece of research. You've built a model which is capable of running any economic scenario. So if the government had its own economic targets for sectors, we could run that scenario through the model and it would tell you the skills implications that arise from that. But in the absence of having that, we've run our own numbers through this, and we run our upper scenario and our baseline scenario numbers through it to provide a range. And the numbers I'll focus on here, the upper scenario, is basically from a policy perspective. We think you should always try and focus on the high growth side of the economy to avoid the possibility of undersupplying skills for the economy. The costs of undermining the competitiveness of the economy are too great. So try and sort of err on the side of optimism. And the numbers that are coming through that are forecast over the next 10 years are for 79,000 jobs over the decade. So 7.9k jobs, just under 8,000 jobs a year. For context, if you look at the last 10 years, the Northern Ireland economy created about 12,000 jobs a year with a global pandemic in the middle of it. So it's an optimistic scenario, but lower job numbers than we have created in the past. So we think optimistic, but not unrealistic would be a good summary of that. I'll skip the sector just to focus on occupation. When we look at what occupations the model is saying are going to grow fastest over the next decade. So it tends to be focused on science, research, engineering, and technology occupations. We're able to break those numbers down into much more detailed occupation forecasts at the 4-digit SOC level is what it's called. And you can see there, based on the job types, there's a typography of what the growth side of the economy is going to look like. It's data analysts, cyber, R&D, pharma. So the typography is high productivity, high growth, high wage jobs that require high level qualifications that are going to drive the growth side of the economy. But that is not the only driver of what skills the economy is going to need going forward. In fact, it's not even the biggest driver. The biggest driver was what we call replacement demand. And that is just what the jobs that are created just through natural labour market churn in the economy. So people retire each year, create a vacancy, creates a job for somebody. People drop out of the labour market for caring, for sickness reasons, migrants leave, could be any multitude of reasons. There's people who naturally join within that labour market, joining from other occupations, unemployed people who are taking jobs, and people returning from a period of economic inactivity. Once we take all of those numbers together and account for the amount of the replacement demand and expansion demand that can be filled from within the existing labour market, what's left over we call the net requirement from education and migration. So it's all those jobs that you can't fill from within your existing labour market. You need to fill them either from your education system or you need to import skills from abroad. And we end up with about 26,000-ish on the replacement demand side per annum, and plus that 8,000 jobs a year growth to give us an overall annual requirement for the Northern economy of 34,500 roughly. So that's what we need to get from the education system, plus migrants each year. Now, why this is important in terms of this graph is that each time we run this modelling now, the replacement demand side of the economy gets a bit bigger, and it's because of what's happening in the Northern Ireland economy. So if you look at the joiners side, so from unemployment 10 years ago was about 60-ish thousand in Northern Ireland. It's 15,000 now. So the number of people that are capable of filling jobs from within the existing labour market from the unemployment side is much, much greater. That boosts the replacement demand side of the economy a little bit. Same with inactivity. The profile of economic inactivity has been weighted much more towards the sickness side of economic inactivity. And the joiner rates of that group are really, 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 really low. So you're getting fewer people filling vacancies from within that side of the economy. And alongside that, we have an aging labour force. So you get even more people here then going to lean towards dropping out due to sickness and other reasons. So we expect that net replacement demand to sort of get a little bit bigger each time we update this analysis. So whenever you account for all of those different things, and account for replacement demand, you get a slightly different picture of what skills demand looks like. It's not just those high productivity, high wage, high growth sectors that demand high level qualifications. Health and caring professionals are number one and two. So you get much more of a broad spectrum of skills demand across the entire economy. So long story short is growth side of the economy is those high jobs requiring high level qualifications. But once you consider replacement demand, it's a much more broad breadth of skills demand across the entire piece. Overall, at the macro level, it works out about 43% of jobs that are going to require at least an undergraduate degree. It's about 40% school leavers that that leave to go to university straight away now. So that's sort of my sense check for saying that the numbers are giving us a relatively sensible starting point there. And again, each time we model this over time, the numbers at the bottom just get smaller and smaller and smaller with with employers being qualifications hungry, and there being slightly fewer jobs for people with very, very low level qualifications. And we bring those together. I don't have time to go through all the different layers of education and what the trends are. I would love to, because it's some of the most interesting stuff. But whenever you bring it all together and you look at rising attainment above school, much more people going through the tertiary level education, more people in higher education than ever before, you end up with people increasing their average amount of years spent in full-time education, which sort of reduces the annual flows into the labour market a little bit every year. Once you account for these, the light blue bit is the number of people who are actually entering the labour market every year across Northern Ireland. So the biggest groups, graduates now, reflecting the changes in education over the years, where we're much more weighted towards higher education in the past now than we were in the past. When we bring them together, we can see where the imbalances are. So if it would just stay where it's meant to. So what you would really notice there, that's showing the balance. So the left-hand side chart is showing where there's an undersupply. So you'll notice overall, there's an overall undersupply, which is saying there just aren't enough people in the Northern labour market to fill this scenario. So in order to meet your requirements that are just coming from labour demand, from natural labour market churn, plus growing at an 8,000 job a year rate, you're 5,500 people short. So you're short quite a lot of people. So it raises quite a lot of big questions for policy here. First of all, for Northern Ireland, is this growth model even sustainable? If you look at what's driven growth over recent decades, no matter sort of what period you pick in the last 30 years, if you do a back of the envelope growth accounting exercise, it's about 2/3 labour inputs growing growth and a small amount of productivity growth. It's like if you look at the demographic trends, if you take the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, the labour market working age population grew by about 90,000 people per decade. 2010s it grew by 15,000, but we were coming out of global recession, austerity, European sovereign debt crisis, all that stuff, which meant there was lots of spare capacity in the labour market. Now you look forward, barely any growth in the working age population. You've unemployment of 15,000, it's the lowest ever. You have an economic inactive population, more weighted towards sick people. The ability to continue to grow based on labour input is much less than it used to be in the past, which means that labour-led model probably doesn't work going forward, and you need something more based upon innovation, productivity, and technology going forward. You may then ask what's happened in the last couple of years. This just doesn't happen overnight. Well, what we've done in the last couple of years is turn towards the migrant side. Northern labour market and payroll employment, I think the last 2 years, 42% has been non-UK nationals. So we're bringing in labour from abroad to fill the jobs. So you need to have a serious conversation about that side. What's an acceptable level of migration? What areas do you need to import skills for? And that's probably not a conversation we're having locally, and raises that question, should we have a regional migration policy rather than operating a UK policy? Also looks then at the reactivation side of the economy to say, well, if you don't have many unemployed people, you've 300,000 odd inactive people. About 50,000 of them say they want to work. So let's look at that group. But then there's no one answer because it's such a diverse group. So you're looking at improving our disabled employment rate being the worst across any UK region by far and having the biggest gap of any UK region. Looking at caring, not just the childcare side, but looking at older age caring. And as we age as a population, that's going to continue to be an issue. We look at students and trying to get more students into work, and also looking at trying to reactivate some more of the sick people, because of the group who say they want to work. People who say they're sick are the biggest group within that. So there's got to be better ways of reactivating people there. Looking at our student flows part of this, I don't want to steal Áine's thunder because she's going to talk about this a little bit next. But there's an element of, sort of keep, attract, retain of, can you keep a little bit more of your Indigenous population from going to study elsewhere? Can you keep more of those people who come and study here, and particularly international students, avail of the skills that they gain here to work in the Northern labour market? And can you attract more people from other parts of the UK and Ireland to come and study here because our inflow rates are very, very low compared to elsewhere? So there's very complex policy environment there in terms of you need a strategy for reactivation and boosting the numbers for participation. There's no one answer that's going to give you enough of a boost to fill 5,500 people. The model can also break down the shortages into subject area at higher education level. I'll just keep that up there briefly. Although there's small number of subjects down there at the bottom, so showing there's a slight oversupply. This isn't an exact science. They're quite close to the axes. They're not, I wouldn't even write those up. They're just not, wouldn't be a concern. It's pretty much, given the overall story as an undersupply of skills. If you want to grow at a rate of 8,000 jobs a year, there are just some subjects that are more undersupplied than others. And the subjects that are most undersupplied tend to be in these STEAM subject areas. So STEM plus arts, plus design, creative arts, and creative arts, where there's a lot of multimedia animation stuff that tends to be quite high growing there. But you throw that in with computing. The report has this at a much more detailed level, so it'll break down the different types of computing. So just straight computer science is the biggest undersupply in that. Subjects allied to medicine, big undersupplies nursing in that area. Engineering technology is fairly even split across different subtypes of engineering. And then we can also break it down into undergrad and postgrad. So similar type of profile with the subjects. So most undersupplied undergrad subjects allied to medicine driven by nursing, computing driven by computer science, and business and management driven by a broad spectrum of subjects within that category. And postgraduate is education and technology and computing and business and management. So without repeating some of those key messages, just in and around rethinking the growth model, how do you fill the 5,500 people? I'll just close off here by looking at what to do next on this, because this is a stream of work which we never really stop. So what comes from me from dealing with stakeholders is the demand for trying to make the information more accessible to sectors. So I'm going to start to work on repackaging a lot of this information into sectoral packs. So sector organizations and employers can start to use it, because I've so much more data than I'm showing on the screen here. And it's trying to get some of that out to people to use. And there's a big demand for sub-regional skills analysis to reflect the differences across council areas across Northern Ireland. So I have to extend this model to the next sub-regional level. So that's sort of going to be my sort of next 18 months, really trying to get that done. I've really only scratched the surface for this. For the main report, there's lots more information in there, particularly in relation to the lifelong learning agenda, much more detailed subject information, employer surveys, and information on what I've presented is really subject area stuff, but of course those are subjects, that's not skills transverse across, and there's lots of information there on what are the most transversal skills that are in demand. So if anything I've said is of any interest to you, I encourage you to go to the reports and download it and start to consume the information. The PowerPoint's really for if you're really into it, because it's mostly data, but the reports is readable, sort of in and around 30 pages. So it'll be accessible over a nice lunchtime somewhere. But if you're not a data nerd, probably stay clear of the PowerPoint. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Mark. That was really interesting. Does anyone have any questions?
Thanks very much, Helen Russell, ESRI. A really interesting presentation. I had two quick questions. One was just looking at the the labour supply issue. One of the things that's come out when we compare Northern Ireland and the Republic is the differences in hours as well. So shorter working hours, more part-time work amongst women. So I'm just wondering, is that a potential additional labour supply as well in the north, and if that can be factored in? The other thing was around the the level 4 or 5, so the FET sort of further education. So again, that seemed to be an area where there seemed to be much fewer graduates at that level, sort of non-degree level, third level education. And is that coming out in the data as well?
Sure.
Thanks.
First one on the female side there with part-time work. Yeah, we see that in the non-learning data as well. So it's very similar pattern. I think it's, if you look at job growth over the last 20 years, like 60% of it is female, so you get a higher percentage of part-time working within that. So it does have that extra layer. The level 4 to 5, isn't it? We do have that as an issue in previous iterations of this when we've run other scenarios. It's come out a bit more pronounced than it does in this current one. But it's the same driver in both. It's more on the supply side than it is the demand side. We have quite a binary education system. It's kind of like you go through the traditional academic route, you do GCSEs, you do A levels, you end up at university type thing. There's not that many alternatives within the sort of tertiary sphere that are an alternative route to that process. You tend to go in and do more practical courses, and they're weighted towards lower level qualifications within further education colleges. So although we have on the demand side, it's not that we have enormous demand, relatively small amount of demand for those level qualifications. We just have barely anybody doing them. They're just not supplied as an option, and so it's a route that sort of feels like it's lacking in a pathway in the system where it's not the alternatives there that probably there should be. And when we map it across other European countries, that professional and technical side, again, it comes across that Northern Ireland's a bit of an outlier in supply. Well, not like that. The UK is an outlier, and we're part of that. It's pretty having the same education system where we come out as being ranked bottom of any international rankings on that. Sweet, got away easily there.
I don't have my cheat sheet, but so next is Áine Doran presenting on brain drain, student mobility in higher education. Thanks very much.
Perfect, excellent. Thank you very much. So this is a joint project with Áine Devlin from the ESRI, who has managed to sneak in from her presentation in another session, and Maureen O'Reilly, and it is jointly funded with the Department for Economy. So this is sort of looking at the idea of brain drain and student mobility in Northern Ireland, or sort of wider higher education, and trying to see if that sort of sometimes perceived problem of brain drain in Northern Ireland exists. And it is something that probably follows on quite nicely from what Mark was talking about there in terms of the skills within the economy as well. So this is an ongoing and probably very early stage in terms of analysis project, trying to understand student mobility in higher education. So we're at the stage where very much maybe we're doing a lot of the background, doing a lot of the groundwork. So we don't have any real in-depth analysis to show you yet. But it is sort of showing you maybe some of the context of where it is at the minute. So we're trying to assess how does student mobility in Northern Ireland compared to other UK regions, a little bit of comparison to the Republic as well, and trying to see if Northern Ireland actually has this brain drain. So this is something that quite often gets mentioned in the media, mentioned anecdotally. We're trying to see, well, what do the available stats on this actually say? Also trying to understand what are some of the factors influencing students in terms of their university choice or where they choose or what region they choose to study in. So we did publish a research bulletin in December 2024. So we are slightly backward in that we published the research bulletin before actually doing any research. So it was just sort of showing the lay of the land, first of all. So I'll give you some of the headline figures that were coming through from that bulletin. So this is showing the percentage of students in higher education in the UK that are enrolled within a higher education institute within their home domicile versus a domicile outside of where they're from. So we can see Northern Ireland, looking at this, doesn't necessarily perform that favourably, particularly compared to England and Scotland. You know, England and Scotland only have a very small percentage of students that are enrolled in higher education institutions outside of England or Scotland, whereas for Northern Ireland, we're looking at about 25% of students from Northern Ireland go elsewhere for higher education. So that, on the face of it, maybe looks like, well, maybe we do have this brain drain that doesn't necessarily look great. However, comparing Northern Ireland as a region to England on the whole as a region isn't necessarily a fair comparison, and you're not really comparing apples with apples. And so we think it'd be much more appropriate to go down into a more regional breakdown. So looking at that, breaking England down into the regions it can be used in. And when you do this, you get a totally different story. So Northern Ireland goes from being quite poor to being second best in the stats. So it's still only a quarter of our students going elsewhere, but that's much smaller compared to what you see in other regions and parts of the UK. You know, east of England, only 27% of their students are staying in their home region. For higher education, London, you've about a 50-50 split. So when you break it down regionally like this, we're only performing second best to Scotland. So the idea that we have this brain drain, if you look at the national figures, yes, that may be the case, but when you break it down regionally, it does look a little bit different. So what we can say is it's maybe not so much a problem of brain drain, it's that we don't get the reciprocal brain gain that the other regions get. So you can see, particularly for Scotland and Wales, they have a lot more students would enter there for education than they have leave. So even though they are losing students, they're getting a lot more students coming in to, in essence, replace them in the system, whereas Northern Ireland has an overall net outflow. So we have more students leaving than are coming in. So it's not necessarily a big case of brain drain. It's we're maybe not getting the same reciprocal number of students coming in. We don't have the same overall level of gain compared to some of the other regions. We then can also look at some of the stats for cross-border student mobility between the north and south. Overall, numbers here are relatively low in terms of student movement, but overall there is a net inflow to Northern Ireland. So there are more students coming up from the south into education in Northern Ireland than there are going from Northern Ireland down into the south. So some of the takeaways from these figures so far is that you look at those four constituent countries of the UK, yes, Northern Ireland doesn't perform particularly favourably. That looks like where, we maybe have this brain drain. But when you look at a more maybe accurate or more appropriate comparison regionally, the story is totally different and we aren't, ranking way down low. And it is maybe this case of it's more a problem of a lack of brain gain rather than a brain drain problem. We have that overall net inflow from the Republic, but like I said, those numbers are quite small. I know some of Anne's colleagues in the ESRI have done some research on this, trying to point to maybe what some of these reasons are. And so there's a couple of things come through, the different application system, how the conversion of points from your A levels to the CSO equivalent, Irish language requirements for different courses, etc. as well. And I know that there have been some policy changes being brought in or have already been brought in to try and address that. So in terms of our project, we have a number of research questions that we're trying to ask and this probably already seems like a very lengthy list, but we're trying to make sure it doesn't grow any bigger because every time we have our meeting with Catherine and her team, we keep coming up with new ideas. So we are trying to limit it to these 7 and hopefully it won't get any bigger. And so we're trying to say, does Northern Ireland have a brain drain? And if so, to what extent? And do we have that brain gain compared to other regions? Trying to see how student enrolment flows are changing over time. So is the situation getting better or worse? Has COVID impacted that, for example? Trying to see who's leaving Northern Ireland for higher education. Are they coming from particular socio-economic backgrounds? Are they coming from particular, regions? Is it a case that students that live in Belfast are more likely to leave and go elsewhere for university because they've already had that Belfast experience? Whereas those that are maybe living down in like Mid-Ulster or Fermanagh coming up to Belfast is already a very big change. So that's enough of sort of new life experience for them without having to go somewhere else. Is it a case of it's people are leaving for particular subjects that maybe aren't available in higher education institutions here? Then also trying to understand why they're leaving. Are they the determined leavers? Or are they reluctant leavers? Are they leaving because they want to? Or are they leaving because they can't, they don't get the grades for the course they want to do here? They have to apply through a clearing process, etc. Also trying to understand who's coming to Northern Ireland for higher education. So again, trying to see what sort of subjects they're coming in from. Are they coming in from particular socio-economic backgrounds? Are they coming here because they want to? Or are they coming here because, again, they didn't necessarily get into their first choice course and they're having to come in through the clearing system? Then we're trying to see how this current brain drain or gain aligns with skills and education. So tying in very closely with what Mark was discussing there in terms of the skills barometer and how it ties in to the graduate flows and the overall linking into the department's 4 economic priorities of good jobs, decarbonisation, regional balance and productivity. So in terms of some of the data sources we're going to be using, this has probably been the biggest sticking point and the slowest point for us that has taken longer than we'd anticipated. We know the data is there, but it has been a bit of a battle to access it. And so some of our main data sources are coming from the Understanding Society data, the UCAS data, and HESA data. So the UCAS is the one that has been the particularly slow one, and thanks to great perseverance from Anne, when we finally got the word through last week that we are hopefully going to get access to it, so we can now finally start doing some proper analysis. And then on top of the data, we have a survey that's currently live for students in institutions in the UK and Republic, trying to understand, where they applied to, why they applied to these different regions, etc. And then Maureen is sort of overseeing a number of stakeholder engagement meetings that we're going to be carrying out. So that will be with different universities, student recruitment teams, with careers and teachers, further education colleges, school teacher department for education. So we have it's going to be a very busy summer for us, gathering this all up. So what I'm going to do next is take you through some of the insights from the survey so far. So the survey's only been live for a couple of weeks, but we have over 100 responses already. Vast majority of responses are from Northern Ireland students in Northern Ireland institutions, but we have some from NI students that have gone elsewhere, or other students that have come into NI, but we're pushing to try and increase those figures a bit more. So one of the questions are asked is, why did or didn't you apply to universities in different regions? So we can see the first one is, why did you apply to universities in Northern Ireland? So big reasons coming through here are students wanting to stay close to home, not necessarily wanting to leave, rating the quality of our universities has been quite good, availability of course, they couldn't afford to leave Northern Ireland. And that's a theme we're going to see coming through in a lot of the responses we're getting. Cost seems to be a really big aspect in influencing student choice. Some of the other things students mentioned were the availability of degree apprenticeships programs in Northern Ireland institutions compared to others, and the transport links between Northern Ireland and their home region, making it very easy for them to travel back and forth. And some applying, saying, I just wanted to keep my options open. And also saying, there were lower tuition fees on offer. In terms of those that didn't apply to NI universities, there were only a small number of people in our survey who noted that they didn't apply to Northern Ireland universities. Some of the things coming through here were, ironically, quality of universities is ranking highly in both of these, so it is quite subjective in terms of students. Again, some no desire to leave their home region. Some were being put off by maybe the political leadership or political instability in Northern Ireland. Some just noting they just had no interest in applying or living here. Then in terms of Scottish universities, why did some of the students apply there? Again, I thought quality of universities was coming across quite well, course availability, strong perceived overall student experience. And again, some of them were noting, they were applying everywhere just to try and keep some of their options open. Why didn't they apply to Scotland? So some of them said they had no desire to move, no desire to leave their home region. And again, costs coming through there as prohibiting some people from moving away. Some of the other responses that came through were the length of the university courses that they wanted to apply for were longer in Scotland compared to in other regions, and that the qualification they would get from the Scottish equivalent of their course wouldn't be appropriate for the job that they wanted to do, and they might have to do like an extra conversion course on top of that. In terms of why they applied for English universities, student experience was coming out top here. Course availability, wanting to leave Northern Ireland was a big reason here for those that applied to the institutions in England. And then those that didn't apply to England, again, no desire to leave. And cost, again, coming through as a big reason why a lot of people aren't applying for regions elsewhere. Then the Welsh universities, very few people in our survey actually applied to any of the Welsh universities, which maybe contradicts some of the data that shows they get a really big net inflow of students. But for those that did apply, it was mainly down to course availability as one of their big driving factors. On the whole, vast majority of respondents didn't apply because they had no desire to go to Wales, no desire to leave their home region, and again, cost very much coming through. And then the final question was in terms of the Republic of Ireland institutions. And again, some of the reasons people applied here, same reasons as lots of your other ones: quality of universities, course availability, family connections there, and availability of jobs after graduation were coming through. Other people were noting some of the other reasons where it was relatively easy to access some of the Republic of Ireland institutions compared to those maybe across the water, and that they felt the environment for their course was maybe better than they might have got in other universities. Then in terms of why you didn't apply to Republic, big thing coming through there is a lack of information about the Irish university system and how it works. People have always been sure about how the application system works. Cost, concerns around housing coming through there is very big reasons. Other things people were noting where, well, applying to the South meant a whole other application on top of your UCAS application as well. You know, not having that language GCSE, etc., acting as a barrier to be able to apply. So we also asked those that were at an institution outside of their home region if they considered themselves a determined leaver or a reluctant leaver. So a determined leaver is someone that has left by choice. They wanted to leave. That was always their plan. Whereas your reluctant leaver is someone who wasn't necessarily leaving by choice. They were leaving because they maybe didn't get into their first choice course and had to go through the clearance system. So those that said they were determined leavers, number of different reasons. You know, they said they wanted to live away from home to gain independence. You know, they wanted to leave Belfast as they'd already grown up there, wanted to experience a new city, and wanted to get the full university experience. They felt there was more opportunities available in other countries. You know, there was maybe more modern, and that some of the Belfast universities were a bit old school in their book, for whatever course they wanted to do. You know, they wanted to boost their career opportunities, and they felt leaving Northern Ireland might do that. And that someone noted that if their only option was staying in Northern Ireland, they wouldn't have continued to study. Then in terms of reluctant leavers, very few people in our survey actually classed themselves as a reluctant leaver. But the two people that gave responses said, you know, they didn't want to leave due to the cost aspect and due to, you know, leaving their family and friends. If they'd stayed at home, they wouldn't have had to pay for rent, etc. And then someone said they didn't want to leave until they were 22, but have had to leave earlier than that because of getting into their course. So I think the question that gives us maybe the most interesting insights is we sort of asked, you know, an open-ended question, what were some of the factors that really influenced your choice of where to study? And this has given, I think, very interesting insight into some of the thought processes going through students' minds. So some people were saying, you know, it just seemed easier to apply for Queen's and Ulster. They offered what they wanted to do. Cost is probably the main reason. Cost of accommodation, costs were primary, so costs very much coming through. And someone else noting access to healthcare was a big thing as well, that they felt if they moved away, they would leave the health system they were in and maybe have to go private. And they were worried about the impacts for that. People wanted to be close enough to home that they could go home whenever they feel like it. They want to have that connection to friends. Someone noted that they live on the border and it was the same distance between Belfast and Dublin, and the deciding factor for them was the course in Belfast had shorter hours, so they were able to commute home and still work more hours in the part-time job as well. Again, more people wanting to stay close to their family and friends. They want to travel when they're finished, and we're worried that moving away might inhibit that. So I don't know if that was maybe eating into more of their savings if they moved away. Again, someone saying primarily cost related. To them, it didn't make sense to go somewhere else, pay higher fees to essentially get the same qualification. Some of the other reasons, again, money very much coming through. Them noting that they didn't have, you know, the access to the funds to be able to go to other universities' open days to see what they'd be sort of, you know, what the course would be like in that institution. So they don't have access to the same level of information. And the families encourage them to stay at home. Northern Ireland universities are maybe easier to get into or perceived easier to get into, potentially cheaper, able to go home, connections to their sports, not applying to the South because of to do the same course in the South required much higher grades than you might have had in the North. Someone noting that they chose Liverpool because that was easy to commute home to as well, and there was quite a strong Northern Ireland student population there as well. And someone saying, you know, they chose Northern Ireland because they feel like there's been more jobs have become available, so that has enticed them to stay at home. And then another question we asked is, which again sort of plays into the point Mark was making about, you know, do students stay after graduation, is we asked, do you plan to return to your home region within 5 years of graduating? So the vast majority of people say yes, or maybe there's only a very small percentage are saying no, they don't plan to return home. So in terms of Northern Ireland students that leave, this is maybe a good thing. They maybe go off and get reskilled and come back. But then for those students, the small number of students that come into the Northern Ireland system, are they necessarily staying? Are we skilling them to our cost? And then they're going off and bringing that, improved human capital back to their own home regions. So some of the takeaways so far, still at very, very early stages. There's a lot of work for us still to do. We're going to have a very busy summer. But one thing that's really coming through is cost seems to be a really important factor for students in thinking about where they go to university. And from my own position as a lecturer and talking to students, I do feel like we're potentially going through a sort of hidden cost of living crisis for students. And I don't think we're fully appreciating how much that's playing into students' decisions. In terms of the Northern Ireland system, I don't think we have the brain drain that gets discussed all the time. It's more a lack of reciprocal brain gain and thinking about, how do we maybe make Northern Ireland a more appealing place for students to come and study in, and then thinking about, again, students not staying or students planning to go home afterwards. So good for students coming back to Northern Ireland, but how do we maybe keep some of those students that move here? How do we keep them within the system with the skills that they've gained? There's also a QR code down to the survey there. So if you know any university students, please pass it on. But that's all from me.
Thanks very much. We are running a bit late, so if there's any quick questions, otherwise,
I'll not stand in front of your lunch if
Yeah.
you don't want me to.
thanks very much, and thanks to all the speakers for attending.